taxi drops us in a narrow little street. A red light painted with number 32 shines over the doorway. We push a swinging door. It is like a cafe full of men and women, but the women are naked. There is heavy smoke, much noise, and the women are trying to get our attention, even before the patron leads us to a table. Henry smiles. They open the door on a room which looks like a velvet-lined jewel casket. The walls are covered with red velvet. The bed is low and has a canopy which conceals a mirror on the ceiling of the bed. The lights are rosy and dim. The women are at ease and cheerful. They are washing themselves in the bidet which is in the room. It is all done casually and with so much indifference that I wonder how one can become interested. The women are joking between themselves. The big woman ties a rubber penis around her waist. It is of an impossible pink. They lie on the bed after slipping their shoes off, but not their black stockings.
Wherever she went and whatever she did, Anaïs Nin always hurried back to her desk to relive the experience in her diary. Written over more than 60 years, the diary records an extraordinary life of sexual and psychological experimentation. When the first volume was published during the 1960s, its intimate revelations won her a devoted following. 20 years after her death, the original unedited diaries are being published. What is emerging from these pages is a very different portrait of this unorthodox literary figure. Anaïs's best friend was her diary. As a girl in New York, she spent long, introspective hours at her writing desk. When, aged 20, she married her sweetheart, Hugo Geiler, he had to accept that Anaïs and her journal were inseparable.
Loving husband, little house, and sweetest home. Oh, I am happy, so happy. And my love is happy too. I can see it in his eyes and in his eagerness to come home at night. He has told me that I have given him more than he ever dreamed of, that I have filled his life with sweetness.
Hugo became a banker and was posted to Paris. For Anaïs, it was a long-awaited homecoming to the city of her birth. At first, she was shocked by the open sensuality of the Parisians. She told her diary she found the city too modern. But her brother noticed her growing sexual curiosity.
She had to experience things, everything, at first hand. She couldn't take somebody else's word for it. And that's a very heady proposition for a young married woman. Surrounded by all kinds of temptations, should we say? I know it's an old-fashioned word, but it's a fairly good word.
Went to the embassy yesterday. Hot, languid, crowded. Argentine tangos, sad singing, handsome women in black furs, jewelry, lames, and velvets. The men possess the same languid, caressing manner and ardent eyes as women who are professional lovemakers. I feel it wrapping me like a perfumed, insidious smoke.
This young man who was getting people to open trusts for the National Bank had a lovely young wife, and they were invited, always invited everywhere. And Anaïs got a little bit tired of being the young executive's beautiful young wife.
In 1930, they moved to the Parisian suburb Louvciennes, to the house Anaïs was to call her laboratory of the soul. Anaïs buried herself in her writing. Bored by Hugo and his banking career, she craved the company of other artists. One night, she invited the penniless American writer Henry Miller and his wife June to dinner.
A startlingly white face, burning eyes. June Mansfield, Henry's wife. A As she came towards me from the darkness of my garden into the light of the doorway, I saw for the first time the most beautiful woman on earth. Her beauty drowned me. As I sat in front of her, I felt that I would do anything mad for her, anything she asked of me. Henry faded. She was color, brilliance, strangeness.
So here is this wild woman, June, with the ragged holes in her stockings and the black makeup running down her face and the green nail polish, reeking of beer and sex and who knows what other bodily smells. And as far as Anaïs was concerned, this was the most artistic woman she had ever encountered. This was the pure artistic soul.
After an intense flirtation with June, Anaïs turned her attention to June's husband. Convinced Henry could be a great writer, she resolved to help him. Henry praised her diary, and what began as a literary passion soon turned into a raging affair.
Well, I've always described Miller as being the genius without talent. I said that to you yesterday, and I repeat it today because I'm rather pleased with that description. I never liked him very much, but of course that could have been my jealousy of another man intervening in my sister's life. He knew that Anaïs had no money and that it came from Hugo. He knew that when Anaïs gave him a typewriter, she was staying without a typewriter. Dinner invitations were always accepted. He never brought anything to Anaïs that I can remember. And he was a spender, a very professional spender.
Henry represented enormous excitement, new adventure to her, and she tended to ignore the negative parts of his character, the fact that he was living off other people and was essentially a very self-centered man. She found him wonderful company and certainly an exciting sexual partner.
I stumbled because of inexperience, dazed by the intensity and savagery of those hours. I only remember Henry's voraciousness, his energy, his discovery of my buttocks, which he finds beautiful, and oh, the flowing of the honey, the paroxysms of joy, hours and hours of coition, equality, the depth I craved, the darkness, the finality, the absolution. The core of my being is touched by a body which overpowers mine, inundates mine, which twists its flamed tongue inside of me with such power. He cries, tell me what you mean, and I cannot. There is blood in my eyes, in my head. Words are drowned. I want to scream savagely, wordlessly, inarticulate cries without sense from the most primitive basis of myself, gushing from my womb like honey.
Once said at my own dinner table, if I have to read one more description of Henry Miller's glowing member, I don't think I can do another day's work. But he was sort of this idealized sex organ. And she was always talking not about a sexual relationship of two people sharing an experience, but always of being taken, of giving, of sort of being the doormat, the receptacle, the vehicle into which this man poured his sexual energy.
I have only 3 desires now: to eat, to sleep, and to fuck. The cabarets excite me. I want to hear raucous music, to see faces, to brush against bodies, to drink fiery Benedictines. Beautiful women and handsome men arouse fierce desires in me. I want to dance, I want drugs, I want to know perverse people, to be intimate with them. I never look at naive faces. I want to bite into life and be torn by it. Henry does not give me all this. I have aroused his love. Curse his love. He can fuck me as no one else can, but I want more than that. I'm going to hell, to hell, to hell. Wild, wild, wild.
Assuring Henry she was faithful, Anaïs experimented with other lovers, men she met in cafes, even her husband's banking colleagues. She began an affair with a Peruvian communist, Gonzalo More. Anaïs used Hugo's money to support him and to buy a houseboat. In her diary, it became the location for their idyllic encounters.
At last we have stepped off the earth, out of Paris, cafes, away from friends, husbands, wives, from streets, houses, the dome, Villa Sierra. We stepped off the earth into water. We are on the ship of our dreams, alone. Big shadows all around, beams of the Middle Ages, water slapping at the stern, the little dark room at the stern like a torture chamber, with tiny barred windows askew. Gonzalo said, "I will lock you up in there and torture you if you ever deceive me." Kisses, laughter, passion, a dream.
Here she is writing about this grand passion. Well, the houseboat leaked. There was no heat. They had to put out buckets to catch the rainwater. The bedding was soggy. Gonzalo didn't like it. He had to be practically bribed to get him to go to this fabulous houseboat.
Well, Gonzalo was another sad sack, I'm sorry to say. He had a great deal of charm. He was a revolutionary in a nice, housebroken, theoretical way. But that impressed Anaïs tremendously.
Every one of her sexual experiences was scrutinized in her diary, a constant process of self-examination. When she heard of Freud's radical ideas, she wanted to be analyzed herself, first by René Allendy, the founder of psychoanalysis in France, and then by one of Freud's own disciples, Otto Rank. She used her charms on them both.
Both Rank and Allendy allowed themselves to be seduced by her. That makes me angry. It was unethical, it was unfair, and it made it impossible for her to work on her problems, her real problems.
I had the vaguest notion of what a psychiatrist was. But it was something Anaïs had discovered. She asked me to go, and I generally did what I was told. So I went to see this Allendy in a very dark room with a sofa naturally and a desk and curtains, very, very heavy curtains, which suddenly were apart. And there he appeared staring at me. And I thought, well, this is psychiatrist. It's very interesting. It's fascinating. And he sat down, and he began to talk to me about Anaïs, how deeply in love he was with her, and how complicated it was, because after all, he was a happily married man. And being a happily married man, you understand that I can't afford to have this passionate affair with your sister. And this went on for the typical 50 minutes of the psychiatric appointment.
On my way to see Dr. Rank, I am planning impostures, cheatings, tricks. I begin to invent what I will tell Dr. Rank instead of coordinating truths. I begin to rehearse speeches, attitudes, gestures, inflections. I see myself talking, and I am sitting within Dr. Rank, judging me. What should I say to create such and such an effect? I meditate lies as others meditate confessions.
Anaïs used her analysts to investigate her sexuality. Her liberated behavior may have been pioneering, but her extreme promiscuity seemed to have a darker significance.
One of Anaïs's basic problems, core problems, that she should have been able to work through in therapy was her need to seduce her father. Her emotional need to seduce him. I didn't mean it literally, though that turned out to be true also.
Mom, can I watch TV? Yes, but don't sit too close. Mom, can I have a biscuit? Yes.
For 20 years, Anaïs Nin had fantasized in her diary about the father who had abandoned her. Joaquin Nin, a penniless Spanish musician, had married Anaïs's mother, an heiress, when he was 21 and she was 30. 10 years later, when the money was gone, he deserted his young family.
In the beginning, he adored the daughter. This was his little princess, and he played games with her. And then as she got older, he began to call her the ugly little girl, gave her a very poor self-image. She was always trying to do something to win his love, to write him a letter, to perform a little song, all sorts of things. And it was as if she were this little fly that he really just wanted to brush away.
Last night I dreamt I received a letter from Papa in which he said, "I'm coming." Oh, if it were true, what happiness! I would be the happiest girl in the world. I write to Papa and always ask him to come. I keep hoping and perhaps he will come. At the moment of Holy Communion, it seems more that I am hugging and kissing Papa rather than receiving the body of Christ. That moment is sweet. I am tired of saying to Papa, "I send you a big hug." I would like to hug him for real.
And she started writing the journals, the childhood journals, when her father left, when I think she was about 10 or 11. And most of those are about her loss and about her father, whom she didn't see again till she was adult.
She invented a legend around him, and a legend that was all the more imperative and lyrical and strong that he wasn't there. So she could invent at her heart's content. She could invent this extraordinary man who did extraordinary things at extraordinary times, and that fulfilled somehow her need for the father figure.
So that when he came back into her life, when he was 55 and she was 33, and they hadn't seen each other since she was 11 years old, suddenly they look at each other as two strangers, and each sees the reflection of himself or herself in the other, and they become attracted to this reflection, and there ensues a kind of power struggle, which Anaïs would claim that she won.
"Let me kiss your mouth." He put his arms around me. I hesitated. I was tortured by a complexity of feelings, wanting his mouth, yet afraid, feeling I was to kiss a brother, yet tempted, terrified, and desirous. I was taught. He smiled and opened his mouth. We kissed, and that kiss unleashed a wave of desire. I was lying across his body, and with my breast I felt his desire, hard, palpitating. Another kiss, more terror than joy, the joy of something unnameable, obscure. He is so beautiful, godlike and womanly, seductive and chiseled, hard and soft, a hard passion.
One can hear heavy piano chords playing in the background, feelings of guilt and transgression and crossing boundaries. She was very aware of all of that, but at the same time, it was always, she always wrote about it in terms of love, a passion that could not be denied.
I wasn't desperately shocked, I mean, because, you know, they were both, the father sounded about the same as she was. They were both narcissistic, and they were really more or less having sex with themselves, I suppose, up to a point.
I can see a psychiatrist saying to her, you know, in order to get rid of your imperative attachment to your father, you should write about him and write all the things that you would have liked to have happened to you. And I think that her so-called amorous experience with her father may have been therapeutic writing that her psychiatrist suggested. I'm not so sure that happened.
It would have been all right to say you want to seduce your father. You've always wanted your father. That would have been a traditional classical Freudian analysis. But to say you're not going to rest until you do it, maybe encouraged her to go. I think she needed that much encouragement. And Anaïs was a very sexual woman. She could have sexualized any relationship. And my guess is that she expected to be freer after having sex with him. And I don't think she was. I don't think it did for her what she hoped it would do.
After 6 months, Anaïs ended the affair and never saw her father again. She abandoned the man who had abandoned her as a child. The following year, Anaïs had the first of many abortions.
This was the most difficult part of the book for me to write, this account of this abortion that she had in Paris in the 1930s. She wasn't sure who the father of this child would be. Henry, her husband, perhaps even Gonzalo.
I sit in the studio in the dark, talking to my child. You should not be thrust into this black world, in which even the greatest joys are tainted with pain, in which we are slaves to material forces. He kicked and stirred. So full of energy, my child. How much better it would be if you had stayed away from earth, in obscurity and unconsciousness, in the paradise of non-being. My little one, not born yet, you are the future. I would prefer to live with men in the present, not with future extensions of myself into the future.
For whatever reason, she decided she would take a few pills, she would wait a while, she would try a potion, one thing and another. So she kept putting off this so-called abortion. And when she was about in her 6th or 7th month of pregnancy, when there was the possibility that she could give birth to a viable child, they found a doctor, probably a refugee from Germany, who needed to make a living, probably a Jewish refugee from Germany. And he was persuaded to do this abortion, to deliver this child.
I was wheeled to the operating room, legs tied and raised, the pose of love in a cold, white operating room, with the clatter of instruments and the smell of blood in my eyes. A tunnel, a push into this tunnel. I bite my lips and push. There is fire, flesh ripping, and no air out of the tunnel. The child is not a child. It is a demon, lying half-choked between my legs, keeping me from living, strangling me, showing only its head. And they talked to each other while I rested. Then I pushed until I heard the bones cracking, until my veins swelled. Till 8 o'clock, I combed my hair. I powdered and perfumed myself and painted all my blood is spilling out. Push, push, it's coming, it's coming. I feel the slipperiness, and then sudden deliverance, and the weight is gone.
Here is this curious episode in which she's in a theater of her own creation, and the hospital bed is her stage, and she's got her eye makeup on and her beautiful lace bed jacket, and all the men have come rushing to her side. I think even Otto Rank was there. I think he was involved in this episode. He might have been one of the ostensible fathers of this poor dead child.
Anaïs reworked the diary account into a short story called The Birth. Critics praised it as an honest, personal account of abortion by a woman.
Everyone in the world sympathized with Anaïs Nin. For years and years and years, she got such sympathy for this truly callous episode. However, for the first time, and many would argue the only time, she turned it into pure art.
In 1939, at the outbreak of war, Anaïs and Hugo returned to New York after 14 years in Paris. Her sexual behavior escalated. She was wildly promiscuous.
I wonder how she found time to write all those passages of the journal after some of her activities. For instance, in Fire and Incest, I mean, she sometimes had sex 3 or 4 times a day with different people. One would have thought she'd be too tired to have written them.
And we passed an old-fashioned garage. I don't think we have many of them anymore. But it was a garage where people parked their cars and also had work done on them, mechanical work. And just in passing, she said, "Oh, I know this place very well. I have sex with all the men there." That's how she was.
As well as writing the diary, Anaïs fictionalized her experiences into a series of novels and short stories. Her style had found little favor with publishers. She was becoming desperate for recognition.
When we first knew her, she was very unhappy because she had not been recognized in any way in this country, and she felt resentful and envious of young men like Gore Vidal who were getting published automatically, and nobody would publish her.
Here in this country especially, it was all Hemingway, realism. And Anaïs' style of writing was more aligned with European writing, more imagery, more fantasy.
Determined to be published, Anaïs bought a press and began to produce, distribute, and advertise her own work herself. Printing was hard work, and she often stood at the press for up to 12 hours a day. Each book was a labor of love. Hugo devotedly financed the operation, but Anaïs was about to fall in love with another man, a young, unemployed actor.
It was very strange. We met in an elevator in a rather posh apartment house in New York, and we just looked at each other, and we laughed later. We said we looked at each other and that was it. But the fates were with us, and we got out at the same floor and discovered we were going to the same party. Anaïs and I went off in the corner and talked with each other all evening, and all the men there were furious because they wanted to talk with Anaïs. They said, why are they spending all their time away from us?
When Rupert announced he was going to Los Angeles to become a forester, Anaïs decided to travel with him.
And so I said, well, I'm driving to California in a couple of weeks. Why don't you come with me, and I'll show you the real United States. The first mile of driving under a tunnel, a little surprised to find ourselves traveling together, Rupert and I, both of us exhausted from the strain of breaking away from New York. He is tense while keeping up a pretense of serenity and nonchalance. He is acting, I feel, most of the time. What is he acting? The role of a hearty, assured man ordering gasoline and oil, studying maps. What a handsome man, I say to myself, watching him in the morning light from inside the car. That is undeniable and obvious to everyone. I am running away with a most beautiful man.
When I met Rupert, I was surprised because he wasn't an intellectual. He had a kind of Hollywood good looks to him. But he wasn't a romantic figure in terms of being famous or particularly dynamic in his own right. And Anaïs, I remember, said to me, you know, you will learn, Tristine, that if there's going to be an artist in relationship, there can't be two. There can only be one, and I would rather it be me.
Well, I knew Anaïs when she had just met this. She called him first the forester, and this sounded like something out of Lady Chatterley's Lover, you know. And I said, how romantic to have a young man in your life, or a man who has another profession entirely, who's sort of an outdoor type, a nature boy.
To entice her to leave her husband, Rupert built a house for Anaïs in Los Angeles. But rather than give up Hugo in New York, she created an extraordinary double life. For the next 20 years, she divided her time between them without either man ever finding out about the other.
She took up with Rupert in 1947, and the relationship lasted until her death in 1973. So they were together 6 weeks on, 6 weeks off, all those years. 6 weeks in Los Angeles, 6 weeks in New York with Hugo. She called it her bi-coastal trapeze. It was a life that required such incredible logistics, so many people to lie for her, so many lies to be told, that she began to write them all down on little file cards.
A wooden box marked on the top, lies. And in it was a card catalog, so she could keep straight her stories about where she was, at what time, and with whom she was supposed to be
I realize now that we did have an arrangement, Anaïs and I, that she would tell me stories and I would pretend to believe them. And this worked. It worked very well. It was good for Anaïs and it was all right for me.
Rupert believed Anaïs had divorced Hugo. He kept asking her to marry him. One day in March 1955, she finally agreed.
And I said, Anaïs, you were a bigamist? And she said, yes, it's been so awful. For 20 years, I've had to lead this hidden life. And I said, you were a bigamist? Only men have done that. That is so great.
And there was quite a contrast between the two husbands, certainly. Anaïs and Hugo came here to dinner on a number of occasions, and they seemed like an old married couple, but they seemed quite devoted to one another. And then I went out to L.A., where I was met by Rupert and Anaïs in Rupert's Silver Thunderbird. Well, it was quite a contrast indeed. The Thunderbird rolled up, and there was Anaïs in a flowing orange raw silk dress, and Rupert was wearing a shirt to match. And Anaïs seemed many years younger. Anaïs enlisted the help of a number of her friends to carry on this deception at both ends.
I told Hugo she's here or there, whichever excuse I could think of. But that, I don't call it a conversation. She only asked me where Anaïs was. But I remember the voice distinctly. It was a voice that sounded pained, because he was always looking for Anaïs.
I resented that he held on to Anaïs so long, because I'm sure that he knew of our relationship, and Anaïs asked him many times for a divorce.
Well, they adored each other. People are surprised to hear me say that, because some people have the notion that she stayed with him out of some kind of obligation, but that's not so. She really loved him. There were times that she wished that she didn't have two men. It was a very complicated life. You had to do some maneuvering to get around it, which she did very expertly. But she loved him. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't leave either one.
Shut out by the literary establishment of the 1950s, Anaïs sought the company of a bohemian set of underground writers, artists, and filmmakers, including Kenneth Anger. She appeared in his recreation of one of their more bizarre parties.
Sometimes we prepared for a party for months. We devoted our lives to the party, so it were a theater performance.
It was a theme party. It was called a Come As Your Madness party, and notice was given well in advance so people could prepare their costumes. And her house in Malibu was really packed. But it was wonderful to see that people's idea of madness in Southern California and Hollywood was to become principally dressed as gods and goddesses. I mean, talk about ego. So Anaïs came as, bare to the waist, topless, but with painted Mayan hieroglyphics on her adolescent-appearing bosoms.
And she had a head in a bird cage. And her entrance was spectacular, because she opened the door to the cage and pulled out of, or so it appeared, pulled out of her mouth what Curtis called the ticker tape of the unconscious. And on that tape were written apart and handed the various guests different messages.
Kenneth Anger was not there when we entered. He was waiting in the bedroom with a lighted candle and asked Renata to let him know the propitious moment to make his entrance. Busy with guests, Renata forgot him. When she remembered, the candle was burnt halfway, but Kenneth made his propitious entrance and everyone stood still to look at him as they had stood still when I came in.
I think in the 1950s, this little subculture, this group, was insufferably arrogant about everything that wasn't us.
Anaïs Nin is posing for me. She is poetry personified. I ask her to read for me.
I am the other face of you. I am the other face of you. I am the other face of you.
In 1966, Anaïs Nin's diary was published in the midst of a sexual revolution. Readers were delighted by what appeared to be a totally frank account of her life in Paris and her affair with Henry Miller. In fact, it was a heavily edited version of the original. Even Hugo had refused to be included, making it appear to readers as if she'd never been married at all.
Someone asked me to pronounce my first name 3 times.
At the age of 63, Anaïs Nin had finally become a famous writer.
It's Anaïs. Anaïs. Anaïs.
Today on Camera 3, a journey through a remarkable world, a world patiently constructed day by day over a lifetime. The diary totals now over 150 volumes and still being written. It records the odyssey, internal and external, of a little girl raised in Paris, daughter of the pianist-composer Joaquin Nin.
He was overjoyed that although he was prevented from training us, our blood obeyed him. One child carried on my father's scientific interest, another his musicianship, and I his talent for living.
The game was over. The game was finished. Life began in earnest. It was very serious, and it was very important to Anaïs. At this point, I believe that Anaïs had written a credo, and that she felt that what she had to say should change the world. She was on a crusade.
All she wrote about were these lovers, Henry Miller and Gonzalo, and it seemed as if she had the kind of life which we women in the 60s were also living. And the fact that she had lived it, survived, she had become a celebrated person, and that disaster had not befallen her. In fact, she was still advocating that kind of lifestyle for women. That was inspirational to us.
The ninnies, that's a term that was used with a great deal of affection by a great many women who adored Anaïs Nin, who set her up almost as a cult figure, someone to structure one's life after. And they either called themselves the daughters of Anaïs, or they called themselves the ninnies.
I had a book signing party at the Gotham Book Mart. The crowd was so big that many people stayed on the stairs, in the bookshop downstairs, and even on the sidewalk. My mail was described by one of my correspondents, not as a fan mail, but as love letters. Suddenly there was joy, celebration, praise, invitations to lecture, flowers, interviews.
Once she got a foothold into being published and being famous, she really worked at it as a sort of major PR operation. She loved fame. I mean, she was addicted to it. She didn't drink, she didn't take drugs. Her drug was fame. She always wanted to be a famous writer.
Anaïs is most famous today not for her diary or her novels, but but for the erotic stories she'd written for a private collector during the 1940s.
And I said, oh, this is wonderful. This is going to be a bestseller. This must be published. And then I said, oh, no, absolutely not. I just wrote it for $1 a page. When Henry had a $100 medical bill, I'd write 100 pages. But I wrote it really tongue-in-cheek. I was making fun of this old man who collected porn and kept saying, more porn and less poetry.
I convinced her that it was indeed publishable and was not masculine. It was entirely feminine in its insights. She agreed to it with some reluctance, and I was given 800 pages of manuscript to carry off to New York and was told I could do anything I wanted with them. So I set about editing what became Delta of Venus and Little Birds.
Later, when it was published, I was surprised to the extent to which, in fact, she had found a unique voice, her own voice, a feminine voice, that it was, in some ways, the stories were the structure of male pornography, but certainly the descriptions, in a lot of cases, the flowery language that she used, and the attempt to poeticize the language, even though it was at the same time explicit. That, I thought, was uniquely Anaïs. Kiss my eyelashes, put your fingers on my eyelids, bite my ear, push back my hair. I have learned to unbutton you so swiftly. All in my mouth, sucking your fingers, the hotness, the frenzy, our cries of satisfaction, one for each impact of your body against mine, each blow a string of joy, driving in a spiral, the core touched, the womb sucks back and forth, open. I can't read this. The idea of
The sexual juxtapositions became so complicated that I had to draw diagrams to make sure that there weren't too many parts involved. And I kept this diagram on my desk and was always afraid that someone would inadvertently find it.
Although many women found her pornography liberating, some feminists accused her of being too traditional.
Most of the women there wore kind of saggy coveralls. There were so many there that they said we had to walk over bodies to get to the podium, and Anaïs got up there and spoke. And one woman called out loud, "Yeah, but you still need a man in your life. You're not independent. You were brought here by a man." At which Anaïs threw up her hands and walked off the stage.
Anaïs had been a role model to women seeking liberated lives, but the edited diaries had given a distorted impression of their heroine. However experimental and independent she had appeared, she had always had the support and security of one, if not two, husbands.
I saw people in the 1970s, based on their reading of the published diaries, leave relationships, homo and heterosexual, abandon children, give up lives of comfort and stability, to go off in search of the great unknown that Anaïs Nin represented to them. And I see a number of these women today in the 1990s, and they're lonely, they're alone, and they will say, after they've had a few drinks, they made a big mistake.
We wanted to be free spirits, as she was. And I think it, especially in the 60s and the 70s, we just, sort of threw off the boundaries and took the big plunge into free sex without any sense of consequences.
I was too influenced by her writing, and I had to break away from it in order to have my own voice. It really gets me in a way that's too consuming, so I don't read it anymore.
Her readers had thought Anaïs's diary was an accurate record of her life written as it happened. But not only had much been left out, there are even questions about the reliability of what was included.
From the 1930s until the diary was published in 1966, that's all a quarter of a century, where she typed and retyped and changed and underlined or removed. So it's a very tampered diary. It's not an authentic diary at all. It's a novel.
I was always aware when I was reading these diaries of a terrible kind of irony, that she had spent her entire life living a lie on every level of her life, and at the same time telling herself, this is the absolute truth. This is the truth, and I'm telling the truth. But the truth was this enormous facade, this enormous construction of nothing but lies.
A biographer needs to unify their own work, so they need to find an angle. So Deirdre Bayer finds the angle that the diaries are a lie and that they're a mask and they're a disguise, very different from the real woman. Well, she didn't know the real woman. I read the diaries, all of them, and I knew the real woman, and it's the same person. They aren't a lie.
I suspect that she may have presented a different face to different people, but certainly the Anaïs that I knew seemed quite different from the Anaïs who appears in the diary, the obsessive, ambitious, humorless woman.
I have told you, Anaïs never lied to the diary. Only to others close to her, and that was always a protective lie, a lie to protect them.
Anaïs died in 1977 after a long battle with cervical cancer.
Anaïs wished her ashes to be scattered at sea in the ocean, which she loved, and the ocean would carry them to all parts of the world. And we set out in this little tiny plane. I found us flying right over the house. I could look down, I could see the pool, I could see Silver Lake. We went out over Santa Monica Bay.
Rupert waited until Hugo died in 1985 before beginning to publish the original uncensored diaries. Readers are learning for the first time of the extent of her duplicities and her affair with her father.
My work is so rewarding because I feel I'm with Anaïs each day as I read the diaries. And of course she is still very much part of this house.
She always said that one day the entire diary could be published, the unexpurgated diary.
And Anaïs said, well, all right, that is your task. I want you to publish them when you feel the time is right.
Well, I know he thinks that, or he wouldn't be issuing them. I'm sure he thinks that, and I don't have any reason to doubt his saying that. But in the years that I knew her, she would not have wanted that published.
I think she would have been horrified to think that her secret diaries have been published during the lifetime of so many people involved.
As Anaïs's friend, I'm very saddened that she was exposed in such an intimate manner. But as a bibliophile, I feel that her work should not be kept from the public because it is literature. And that's the way I still feel about it. I'm torn, deeply torn.
I am very happy. I stand at the center of my self-created world where everything for the moment is as I wanted. I have plotted, lied, tyrannized, struggled until I have come to my real desire. My next book will be called White Lies.
Tomorrow night on 4, the real Diane Fossey, the incredible story of the woman who devoted her life to the study of gorillas. That's tomorrow night at 3:40. And next up tonight, cringe-making memories of the school disco.